The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Catherine Castleman. I'm a project coordinator with the Food Day campaign, and we're very glad that so many of you could join this call today. We're very excited to be joined by Michael Dimock of Roots of Change. He's the president of that organization. They're based in California. And we'll be hearing today about unifying your food system in your state to make change. And we're very excited to have Michael presenting. I just wanted to take a few moments to talk through the webinar platform here and give you just a little bit more information about our Food Day Leadership Series. So this call will be recorded, and we will be sending a link to everyone who registered for the call. So if you missed it, you can send the slides and the link to your colleagues, and we hope you will. I'll just start, and then we'll go straight to Michael Dimock for questions and discussion throughout his presentation. And for those of you who haven't used GoToWebinar before, the way that the discussion and Q&A sections work is that you can either type chat box that you see on your screen, and I will read them out, or you can press the raise hand icon, which looks like a little hand on your dashboard there, and we'll try to unmute you so you can speak directly to the audience. So choose either of those options if you'd like to participate in the discussion. As I mentioned, we'll record this call and we'll send out a link within 1 week. And if you have any questions or need specific help, please contact us at cpinet.org. Again, here's the schedule for our Food Day Leadership Series. We started the Food Day Leadership Series to build the capacity of our network and provide skills from experts in the field that are working in the food system, so that you can use this information and translate it into the setting that you're working in. Our first leadership series webinar was on policy advocacy, and we had the California Center for Public Health Advocacy presenting there. It was a great presentation, and you can find that archived on our website, foodday.org/update, and that's also where you can register for these upcoming calls. May 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern, we'll be talking about community change and making community change in the context of the food system. June 19th, we'll be talking about policy change, and we'll be joined by Mark Winnie, who's a food policy consultant. And July 17th, making your point to the media. So really translating and framing this messaging to make an effective point. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Michael Dimock from Roots of Change and let him begin his presentation.
Thank you, Catherine. I appreciate it very much. This is, I hope, will be an interesting conversation with you all. I'm going to go through some slides. Okay, and Catherine, I guess you're going to change the slide, so I'll just say, well, I think you should probably go to the next slide.
Okay. There's a tiny delay, but that should change now.
Okay. So that's who you're talking to, and I'm going to really talk from the experience that we've had at Roots of Change here over the last 6-7 years. Some of it I'll actually even touch farther back, but the goal is to share our experience and then have folks ask questions or make comments so that we get some dialogue going at a couple of points in the actual slideshow. So let's go to the next slide. So the goal here is to talk about how we might build the power of the food movement across the United States, and I'm particularly talking about California because that's where we are working. And I always like to start with context, historical context, and I think it's really important to note that when many of the ideas that we're talking about today began, they were really part of an alternative social movement in the United States. People had, going back to the 60s, we're going back to the land, beginning organic agriculture. The different communities were thinking about how to feed themselves in better ways, urban and rural, actually. And we know the Black Panthers in Oakland were feeding kids in the morning. So there was a beginning way back, and it was all about being alternative to the mainstream at that point. And Roots of Change was actually birthed by a group of foundations that had been investing for decades and trying to make change in the 70s particularly and 80s, and realized that the impacts that they had hoped for were not occurring. So they began to think about how you could do it more strategically and effectively. And one of the first things they did was commission studies and bring together some great folks, thinkers from across the food system, from former policymakers, innovative farmers, big and small, thoughtful social justice advocates. A bunch of people were brought together to think about what needed to happen. And what they realized is that the culture of alternative was keeping many of the ideas from hitting the mainstream. So Roots of Change was set up to actually break out. And that's the historical roots. But I think it's really interesting to note what's going on today. If you look at the media coverage, a lot of what we're talking about gets very good coverage. We know that people in their communities around the United States are winning local battles to make change, whether it's urban agriculture or local food systems, farm to school, nutrition access, incentives for nutrition, farming systems that are more ecologically sound. We're winning locally, but the big fights are very tough to win. And in fact, as we become more successful in making change, some of the resistance is growing. The Farm Bill is a great example. There's a real stalemate there. But that's happening at the state level too. We know about the ag-gag bills and many other things that are happening where folks who feel being, in some sense threatened by the emerging change are resisting that using policy mechanisms and other mechanisms. So that's the historical context. Let's go to the next slide. So the question is, what's it take to get through that? That's really what we're going to focus on. Go to the next slide. And the way I would describe, and the way that Roots of Change describes, is we're trying to shift the balance of power. Because the way the food system works today, we know that in some sense our democracy has been eroded by the way that campaign finance works, the way that the culture of lobbyists works. It's very difficult for us to break through that kind of protective wall of the status quo to get the change we want. So it's really about aggregating power. And in one sense, what we would call re-democratizing the food system, so that decision-making from the people can actually end up changing the rules by which the system is evolving and changing. Let's go to the next slide. So how do we do that? Well, we got to make our voices heard, right? And there are, I think, two things to think about. One is that politicians obviously care most about votes. And if they're thinking about getting reelected, they have to be sensitive to how the electorate's going to respond to the positions they've taken. But it's also the same for CEOs. Their currency is not votes. That's obviously profits and money. And they actually do look at market segments and market regions when they make the calculations of what they want to do. So the way we look at it is that we want to impact those things that they care most about, whether it's votes or dollars. And by doing that, our voices will be heard. Let's go to the next slide. So the three things, and there are lots of people, I think, starting to look at this right now, what's needed in the food movement, because we have had some victory, but we're not really making the big changes that need to occur. So I know many of you are probably thinking the same thing, that we need unified voices and coordinated action and shared strategy, which the other two really emerge from. So we have spent a lot of time, and I'm going to talk more deeply about it in California, about thinking about what kind of a strategy would actually make change here, and how do you get to a place where you can get a unified voice and coordinated actions. Because currently we have a ton of great organizations and people out there doing very creative things, but we're all acting somewhat as independent actors. There are, Food Day is a good example of a cross-cutting attempt to bring people into coordinated action on a certain day around a certain set of activities. And that's a wonderful kind of emergent characteristic of the food movement maturing in a way. And that's important because that's how you scale things to where the voice is heard, so to speak. So our hope, I think, at Roots of Change is that we can begin to synchronize local and state activity and tie that to federal and eventually global activity to make it clear to policymakers and decision makers in companies that there is a super majority or a vast majority of people that want specific changes. Now, it's going to take a while to get there. That's a lot to ask, but as I said, Food Day is a good example of us moving in that direction. I think a lot of stuff that Slow Food USA is doing and other large organizations, or national organizations, are doing to kind of synchronize activities are important indicators of a maturation process. This slide here actually just is a little bitty piece of a larger map that we use to describe the intervention points, and there are many in the food system. And the goal is for us to begin to agree on which intervention points we all could throw ourselves into to get systemic change underway. So I'm going to actually stop because I think it's important for us to see if the assumptions I'm throwing out, and I'll repeat them, are things that you agree with or would consider wrong, and you'd want to point that out or not full enough. But so we are winning in some ways. These are the assumptions I'm throwing out. We're winning in some ways, but the big fights still remain ahead of us, and we're not making great progress on those. We need to arrive at some sort of commonly held strategy or understanding of what the big leverage points are. And once we do that, we can unify our voices and coordinate actions in ways that will be what I would say unstoppable, because they'll be too big of a force for anyone to resist. I think you've seen some important examples of that around immigration reform, which has been a long process and is about to take place, and I think you've seen some of that around the marriage equality activities that have been occurring. People have worked for a long time to coordinate themselves around action and message to get to a place. And when we do that, we'll begin to get the policymakers and the CEOs to feel the impact. And they'll realize that if they don't go with us, they're going to suffer consequences, deep consequences for themselves and for their companies. So, Catherine, I'm going to turn it back over to you to figure out how we can get people to communicate with us. Why don't you go to the next slide, though, because people can also tweet, which I think is an important tool. And if you want to post, we have a hashtag that you could also use if you want to talk to the world and your colleagues. So there's hashtags up there for you to see on the screen. But anyway, Catherine, you want to open it up?
Great. So yeah, just to remind people again, you can either type in a question or comment on the chat screen there, or you can press the raise hand icon and I will try to unmute you so you can make your comment verbally. We already have one comment from Gail Wadsworth. She says, I agree with Michael's statements overall. However, I don't think we are a vast majority of the population, and I think this is part of our challenge. So, Michael, do you want to address any part of that?
Yeah, I think that actually is it depends on the issue. We're talking about a complex set of things here, and I think on some issues that's absolutely right. On other issues it may not be right. And what do we mean by vast majority? So I'm just trying to think. It was interesting when, I'm going to talk about this later, but Prop 37 was an example. At one point there were 64% of the population was for this idea of labeling, but then that didn't turn out to be the case when the votes were cast. So I think it is dependent on the topic area, but I will not argue with Gail that there are lots of issues probably within our full quiver of issues we want to see changes. And there are many places where a vast majority doesn't know enough to even have an opinion, number one, or there may be real splits. For instance, a good one is some people are talking about beverage taxes in our movement, and others don't really want to see that. So if we're split, you can only imagine where the nation is on that.
Okay, yeah, and we had another comment along a similar vein. How do we develop a shared strategy nationally?
Well, let me just share a little bit about how we did it here, and I want to say that it's not, the shared strategy is not completed. That is a long process, and it requires a level of trust, which is really the next piece that I want to talk about in my talk. So I think that's really what the next piece is about, is how do you get to that. And so I'm going to defer that question, and then we'll take it up again if it's not clear after the next section.
Okay, and Wendy Dennis, I see you're joined in by phone, but you'll just need to hit your audio pin, and then we'll be able to hear you. So you should, I just sent it to you, and once you've hit that audio pin, then I'll unmute you, and we can ask your question as well, or make your comment. So in the meanwhile, yeah, Gail Wadsworth echoes, that's why it's so important to unify, yeah, to get people on the same page. And Gabriel Key had a good question. He's asking about the logistics here. Are we tweeting and typing our questions? And I think, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're encouraging folks to live tweet, but also just to use these hashtags to continue the conversation.
Right.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, if you have questions specifically for this webinar, just go ahead and type them in or press the raise hand button, and then you can use those hashtags to sort of continue the conversation on Twitter. So Gabriel Key also asks, how will the groups at the local, state, or regional levels be engaged and or selected? And maybe that's something that Michael will be able to address in his conversation coming up.
Okay, right.
And, okay, Letitia says, it seems to me one big missing piece in growing and unifying the food movement is identifying state and federal elected officials to carry out our agenda in the legislative debate. Thoughts on that?
Good, yes. I think that's right. And I will talk about this later. I think building those alliances with policymakers is a huge piece of the work, particularly at the local and state level in the early stages, but definitely in the federal level, obviously, as we move forward. There are John Tester and others in the last couple of years at the federal level have showed Pingree back east, and I think it's in Maine. Shelley Pingree has also kind of showed provided examples of policymakers who can become allies with us and carry our messages in our policy frameworks forward. So that's absolutely essential, and in fact, Roots of Change and the network of folks we work with have spent years really developing those relationships at the local and the state level, and that is important, and we support the work of NSAC. We're an ally to NSAC here in California, which is doing it at the federal level. The NSAC team here in California is doing a fabulous job connecting with the congressional delegation from California. So it is important work.
Okay, we have two more quick comments and questions, then maybe we can move on to your next part of the presentation.
Good.
So Eileen Sweeney says, two comments. Immigration and marriage equality are not dominated by corporations the same way that big food and ag companies dominate the food movement. Why doesn't the food movement become part of the climate change movement, which addresses corporate control of the health of humans, other species, and the land and air?
I love that comment. I think it's absolutely right. I think that that part of the core of the problem for us in making change is that the food system is actually, in some senses, a very old system with very deep embedded interests in the current dominant paradigm. I think that's absolutely correct. And I think that the work that 350.org and others are doing in the climate movement are really great examples. I'm going to talk about that divestment, maybe and civil disobedience where real harm is being done may be part of the next phase of the food movement. So I agree, and that's the climate movement is a great ally. We should be linked, and in some ways I think those links are beginning. I was just at a big food movement meeting in Kentucky 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago. Bill McKibben came and gave a talk at lunch and was really good about linking the two worlds. So thank you. Good comment.
All right, and this is the final one from Susan Clark. She says, today there is a report out that 87% of supermarket meat is contaminated with bacteria, a lot of it antibiotic-resistant bacteria. How can this kind of information be useful in building a movement? And I will note that I think that might be CSPI's, the Center for Science in the Public Interest, Risky Meat report that she's referring to.
Well, I think it could be the EWG report too, or maybe they work together on it.
Oh, okay.
I saw that earlier today, and I think that Susan's right. And Susan, I'm glad you're on the call. Susan Clark was actually one of the early persons that even conceived the idea of roots of change, and she and the Columbia Foundation have been great supporters and allies and thought partners in the development of this collaboration between, and I'm going to talk about this again at the end, philanthropy and the nonprofit sector. So yes, I think it's absolutely true that issues around health are one of the things that will drive lots of people, we all know this, into the food movement. We've got to find the right messaging to do it. The issues of antibiotics and antibiotic-resistant bacteria in our food supply, I think, is a powerful lever.
Great. Okay. So I guess we'll move back to the presentation now, and then we can go ahead.
So I'm going to give some details about how we got started. And I talked a little bit at the beginning about the fact that in the 90s it became apparent that although a lot of people were doing good work, it wasn't adding up in the sense that we weren't having strategic impact that was really stopping the trends in degradation of the environment or human health or the rising poverty in the rural regions or the inequities that farm workers were suffering. So a community of people got together and said, we have to figure out a different way. And we can go to the next slide. A process of convening people was born. Just the thought process of actually conceiving what Roots of Change would become was a convening process in which people came to agreement on a way to act. And they began with this idea of systems thinking. You couldn't think just about the farm if you're going to change it. You had to think about the whole system, which automatically broadened the number of stakeholders from just organic farmers or organic retailers to or people who wanted to eat organic into a huge body of actors who could become part of the solution. And elected officials, one of the founding thinkers had been former Deputy Secretary of USDA and Secretary in California, Richard Rominger. He brought a real policy perspective with some others and talked about the need to have these linkages with elected officials early on. this idea is actually a small idea, but very powerful idea of putting stakeholders in a room and using systems thinking so that they actually thought about all the integrated impacts of food on culture, on economy, on the environment, and getting them to think about what it would take to make change. So that model was actually also being done kind of independently in Ventura County, and also Jonathan Kaplan at NRDC, who runs a lot of their food work, had been thinking about doing something at the state level where you had consensus building between environmentalists and the large ag organizations. So Roots of Change's early investments were in the convening of people up and down the state in small circles to think about the system holistically and find where they had common ground and could push against the resistance for change together, even though they may not be typical allies. So early on, for instance, the big ag organizations in California and environmental organizations agreed on goals for the stewardship portions of the Farm Bill. And in many counties in the state where Roots of Change invested in building these small stakeholder groups at the county level to think about the future of their food system, they got folks to agree on how they'd like to see their food system evolve in that place. So that thinking was really important because, and that convening, because it created relationships. And when you have relationship, you have the opportunity to do things you can't do without relationship. Because I'm going to keep going back to this idea of relationship. But and Roots of Change as an entity knew that it couldn't make change as an entity by itself. It had to have allies around the state. And one of the earlier ones was the Ag Innovations Network, a group that works on consensus building and solving difficult problems by getting people to think systemically together. So that began a process for us of NRDC was an ally, others came in, and we began to build a network of relationships that has grown over the last 7 years through the kinds of projects that we undertook. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the key thought that I want to bring to bear. All of us have relationships, and the question is, how do we use those relationships like a fulcrum? And the basis of relationship that is a working relationship, because you can know someone and they can like you or they can think what you're doing is cool, but will they invest time, energy, and treasure in what you're doing? That's the big challenge, and that willingness to go the next step comes from this idea of building trust. But before I move on, I want to talk about something that's interesting to me, that because I think about this a lot. In the food movement, we talk a lot about, when we're talking about sustainable agriculture, mimicking nature. And one of the incredible things about nature is that it's really efficient at using energy. And I was just, as I said, and I was in Kentucky just recently, and many of you might know Fred Kirschman, great farmer and advocate for food system change out of Iowa and North Dakota. And he talked about the fact that back when we were hunter-gatherers, it took 1 kilocalorie of energy, 1 kilocalorie of energy to acquire 20 kilocalories of food. So we were really efficient. For one energy input from our bodies, we were getting 20 units of energy back. When we moved to farming, early farming, before industrial farming, actually our efficiency dropped because it's a lot harder to actually grow crops than it is to go look for things and pick them up and eat them. So it dropped to, for 1 calorie of energy we put in, we got 10 calories back from agriculture. The incredible thing is today, because of fossil fuels, it takes 20 kilocalories of energy from fossil fuel to get 1 kilocalorie of food energy. So we've completely flipped the system. And the key to that problem is the lack of relationship. We've utilized oil and fossil fuel to replace relationships that create synergy. That's an important concept because we have to do the same thing in the food movement. We have to create synergy between organizations to be efficient with energy to get the impact and the payoff. So nature wants diversity because diversity becomes the pathway for energy to be used efficiently. So that's what we've got to think like as we organize this movement. So let's go to the next slide. As I said, convening is the way that you bring people into relationship. And I want to just talk about the different ways we've done it. From 2004 to 2011, we funded, working with Ag Innovations, a series of roundtables up and down the state. There are now, and they're funding them themselves now, there are now, I think they've got 7 or 8, and they're moving 3 more this year. They're either called Ag Futures Alliances or Food Systems Alliances. These are local groups building agreement on the types of policies and practices they want around their food system. At the same time, there are food policy councils up and down the state that are doing similar work, usually more urban. There's also a statewide body that we spawned at the beginning, working with NRDC and others, which I mentioned, the California Roundtable on Ag and the Environment, meets every 6 weeks in Sacramento. Big organizations, the big environmental organizations, the big ag organizations, Farm Bureau, Cattlemen, Western Growers, Defenders of Wildlife, EWG, I'm blanking right now, but you name the big groups from the environment, and most of them are there or have been there working. Then we've also funded a series of roundtables with mayors, and this gets into the work of how do you connect. Mayors are a great way to work because mayors have to be very sensitive to the people in their community, and they're reachable. Back in 2008, Rock was part of the group that put together the big Slow Food Nation event. Through that, we developed a relationship with Gavin Newsom. He agreed to bring 25 leaders from the city and 25 from the countryside together to talk about a food shed policy for his city. That led us to do the same kind of work in LA and San Diego, which created relationships and models of how a group of community members from the urban and rural regions who came into relationship around a common vision for their food system could impact a mayor, and a mayor loves that because that's a larger constituency group. If they, in the case of Gavin Newsom, wanted to run for governor, it was perfect for him to reach out to the countryside, create a relationship. He agreed to support. He changed food policies within the city around procurement and set up for urban agriculture work that Spur and others in this San Francisco are now building off of that first consciousness of the city to move in a certain direction. So we now have ordinances for urban agriculture. We have the different departments of the city thinking about food, which they've never done before. LA did the same thing. They saw actually staffers for Villaraigosa down in LA came to the first big meeting where Gavin Newsom talked about what he was doing, and Ron Dellums came from Oakland. So we had these 2 mayors. A key staffer, Paula Daniels from LA, who worked for Villaraigosa, came to that meeting, said, we're thinking the same way. We've got some things started in Los Angeles. Can we work with you to go another step down in LA? So then what you get is an example of how you can organize from the grassroots to the grass tops in a very specific place and make changes, because Villaraigosa went on to be a member of the National Conference of Mayors, organized with 10 other big city mayors to sign a letter that went to the Congress around the Farm Bill asking for stewardship in addition to changes to, and protection of SNAP. So big city mayors had never really weighed in before on stewardship issues. So it happened because the people in his community, and we had people from Fresno to San Diego, which are really represent the LA food shed, come together with him. We also, at the same time, during these years, built a consortium of 13 organizations, 10 organizations working in 13 counties who run farmers markets to increase SNAP incentives. And so we worked with them to do a joint project to the state of California to get $500,000 a year in funding to run this project, which we divided the money up among the members. So this is an important little model. You get people who have a relationship, have a common goal, you get them to write a grant together. Politically, it's very sexy for a government to fund something that's going to spread the wealth, so to speak, to 10 organizations in 13 counties. That was very important for the state to do that. Nutrition incentives is a huge thing. But what's really exciting is that this group, called the California Farmers Market Consortium, is now a new institution unto itself, which is being absorbed by a larger association of farmers markets in the state of California, being run by the Ecology Center out of Berkeley. So an institution was created by these 13 organizations with ROC acting as a backbone. They have now taken it to the next level, decided they want to work together on both policy and the refinement of their work to provide nutrition incentives for low-income communities, WIC and SNAP mothers who visit farmers markets. And so the potentiality of creating these communities of common goal, common concern, these affiliated associations seeking pieces of change within the food movement become powerful vehicles because they can aggregate and build into stronger networks of power. The thing that's emerged out of all this kind of convening, you can see the map up there with those little rings. There are groups of people in all those communities. So in 2011 and 12, ROC thought about the staff and the board and our funders. We thought about what could we do at the next level. And we decided that the next thing needed to happen is we needed to aggregate all of those institutional bodies, those bodies of the cell of those cells of the body of California into one giant organization or network called the California Food Policy Council. Let's move to the next slide. I actually forgot this slide. We can keep going. Go to the next slide. That was when we worked with Villaraigosa. I talked about that already. So the idea of the California Food Policy Council is there are now 30 regions in the state that have local food policy bodies. Together, those 30 regions represent 80% of the state's votes. Together, the members of those 30 regions are the equivalent or represent nearly 1,000 organizations. I think it's 900 and something organizations. That is, the members of all these councils and organizations, either a Food Policy Council, a Food Systems Alliance, an Ag Futures Alliance, at the state or county level, together there are about almost 1,000 organizations networked through those bodies. So by pulling the California Food Policy Council together to actually act as a unified voice for all those regions is our current mission. But when you start to aggregate, you have to start thinking deeply about the needs of that group of people. And I think California is a microcosm for the entire food movement. And so this slide really switches us into some things that have to happen in order for us to get to the next level. I said earlier we need a common strategy, a unified voice, and coordinated action. It's easy to say, but it's hard to do. And there's some super sauce needed to get us there. I want to talk about that. And the first one I want to talk about is the fact that communities of color, under-resourced communities who have been part of the food movement and under-resourced for decades, need to be brought into the center of the fight. And we've been experimenting with that in the last, my screen went dead, by the way, experimenting with that recently. And I want to put some context to this. So in 2010, some oil companies in Southern California and Texas tried to end the AB 32, the climate change legislation here in California. And they were trying to reverse some really good work. Well, when that election was held, it turned out that communities of color were the edge that ensured that Prop 23 was defeated and our climate change legislation was not overturned. That was a really important lesson. There's other data that shows that particularly Latino communities vote consistently for water conservation, water pollution prevention acts, and ag land preservation acts here in California. We saw in Prop 37 a fight which began really well, but because there was no major ground war, that is, there was no community action at the grassroots, we ended up losing that. And then in 2012, we saw from Obama's win that there is a shift, a democratic shift, a demographic shift in the voter base of this nation. And we have to kind of, if we're going to embrace the future, we have to embrace the full diversity of the future. That's our feeling here at Roots of Change and among many of our allies. So we have joined forces with People's Grocery in Oakland to figure out how we can both model true deep allyship between an organization you might call somewhat privileged, like Roots of Change, where we've had a steady stream of funding, and an organization like People's Grocery that's working in a very difficult economic situation with a lot less money. And how do we become deeply allies and trust each other? And then how do we create a context for other organizations who are divergent in this way to come together and work together? And so People's Grocery, the Oakland Food Policy Council are integral parts of the California Food Policy Council trying to innovate ways for us to invite communities of color that have been under-resourced up and down the state into the Food Policy Council. So let's move to the next slide. The other really important thing is the idea that there are different forces, different types of roles, and different types of people within and organizations within the food movement. Steve Stevenson, an academic out of the Midwest years ago, wrote a great piece based on some other social scientist work in which he identified warriors, weavers, and builders of three types of people in the food movement. And it's important for us to realize that each of these has a different role to play. And these are archetypes, so some of us, organizations and people, might play more than one of these roles. But it's important to be aware of them so that we can be strategic about how we use each other's roles and talents at different times as we act. So just to quickly say, warriors obviously are those who are fight. A lot of the big environmental NGOs and social, unions are warriors often. And they're good at fundraising because the story is clear between the good and the bad. But when you're a warrior, you create enemies, so it's hard to build networks, which is what weavers do. Roots of Change is a weaver. Ag Innovations is a weaver who put people together, convene, and get them to agree to build a common vision and some goals. Weaving is really important right now in the food movement. And then there are builders, and ROC actually plays a weaving role and a building role because we've been building lots of institutions by investing in projects that create institutions. I described the Farmers Market Consortium. The California Food Policy Council is a new institution. So builders, entrepreneurs are builders. Those who are building companies are builders. And all three of those have important roles to play in the food movement, and we have to think about how we're going to use them as we join forces and build common strategy. Let's move to the next slide. And the last thing I think that's really important is philanthropy and NGOs. So the world has changed a lot from the time of the civil rights movement. The philanthropic sector wasn't as mature. The NGO sector wasn't as mature then. We have now a kind of professional class of activists, which we didn't always have. And that has advantages and disadvantages. One of the big problems that we have to deal with, and which is to not let the competition between NGOs for money destroy our ability to actually become allies and work together. And we've experienced a lot through the years. The difficulty of being seen as an organization that's doing well and therefore is automatically competition. And believe me, we are well aware that that can make it very difficult for smoother relations between NGOs working together. And so both NGOs and the philanthropic sector have a responsibility in dealing with this reality of the fact that there's less money than there are people wanting money. But I think we can go a long way, and there are examples, the REAMP project out of the Midwest, where funding pools are created by funders, and the funders and the NGOs work together to determine how that money gets spent. There's some really good examples of that emerging, and I think that's a lot of hope for us in the future. So I think that the data that's coming out of those who are studying social networks, social change activity, is calling for this idea of collective impact, where NGOs aggregate their skills, talents, and resources to attack a problem collectively. And it begins with talk among those organizations and their funders about how to get it done. And that's really what I'm calling for us to do, to move to that level of communication and trust. And because if we can't talk openly with our colleagues in the field, and break through the the concerns around competition, and if we can't tell the truth to the funders because we want to keep getting money, we don't tell them what's working and what isn't working, then we won't be as effective. So I've said a lot. I think what I'll do is stop here and see if we can talk a little, get some people talking and asking questions.
Great. So we have a few remaining questions from the last session that we didn't get to, but two quick ones. Number one from Marie, who asked, how can I become part of your consortium? And the other one from Maria Van Dyke, who asked, what was the name of the group in the Midwest that you mentioned that pools their money?
Yeah, that's climate work. I'll take the pooling money first. Climate work. It's called REAMP, which is really about stimulating. It's a collaboration between NGOs and I think 5 or 7 or 8 states to supplant dirty coal plants with renewable energy sources. And if you send me an email, I can connect you with the folks that are running that. Rick Reed and is kind of one of the main guys, is the main guy running that project. But it's a really good example that's impacted Roots of Change and how we think. And you can look up REAMP. You can Google REAMP. There's a really beautiful case study done by the Monitor Institute about it, and we'll tell you all about it and actually probably get you in touch with Rick and his team. The second question regarding the consortium, if you're referring to the Farmers Market Consortium, actually the folks you want to contact now are the Ecology Center in Berkeley. Carly Brinkman, I think, is the person who's working with Bobby Payton from our team to manage that project in this transition period where Ecology Center is taking over. But I would contact the Ecology Center in Berkeley, and you can write me again, or Bobby at rootsofchange.org, Bobby at rootsofchange.org, B-O-B-I-E, and she can connect you.
Okay, and we have a few other questions and comments left over from last time. So let's see, Tara Marino just wanted to share a follow-up to our discussion of corporate control, that she's a dietitian and has been greatly disappointed with the sponsorships between the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and companies like McDonald's and Pepsi. They're using our association to make themselves look better while making RDs look foolish. Gabriel Key says, isn't the primary drive to change consumption habits as well as the system? If so, isn't there a very high risk of social pushback when social disobedience is used, potentially creating greater divides from those who currently support the movement versus those who do not?
Yeah, I think
that.
I think it's an important point. When you start talking about civil disobedience, you have to be very careful, right? So we're not talking about destructive things. We're talking about peaceful manifestations of emblematic resistance. I love that term that actually was coined by Richard McCarthy, the new president of Slow Food USA, emblematic resistance. And the other term he's using is joy and justice, which I think are two great terms that we should be thinking about. But emblematic resistance, I think 350.org has done some really good work of bringing people out all around the world, or in front of the White House, or in city squares in San Francisco, all around the country on certain days to stand up. We have really done none of that, very little of that in the food movement. And I think it's important that we think about it, but doing it in creative ways. One of the best things that I knew, and one of the reasons I got involved with the slow food movement years ago, was because the first thing that slow food did in Italy was an emblematic resistance, where Carlo Petrini organized 100 people to stand in front of the first McDonald's with a bowl of pasta in their hand, so that people had to walk through 2 rows. Basically, they created a column, 2 rows of people who walked through the doors of McDonald's, 50 on each side. So you'd have to walk by people with reminding you about the pasta, that Italy was the home of pasta. So that was an emblematic resistance, non-threatening, kind of funny even, but drove home a message. So I think that's the beauty of diversity. There are probably a million ways, 1,000 ways. There's 100 people on the line right now. 1,000 ways that we could all think about acting in emblematic ways that are not necessarily threatening, but or certainly not violent, but making a very clear point that things have to change. And one of the things that I think, divestment is another big one. Why aren't we calling for people to divest from the big companies that are in fact making the dietitians look bad? I mean, why don't we do that? That would be an interesting approach. It gets serious really quickly, and you do build resistance, but it may be something that we have to think about.
Okay, we have Isabel Estolano sort of posted a response and a question to Susan Clark's point about antibiotic resistance. Isabel says there's currently a bill that Representative Slaughter from New York has introduced which would impose limits on the use of antibiotics in our food supply. And I sent that link by chat to everybody so they can see it. And her question is, how can we join forces and support this bill on a national level, in addition to making efforts here in the state of California to protect food from the overuse of antibiotics? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, here's the big thing. I'm glad you asked this question because it brings home the point. One of the big challenges we have is that a lot of the large NGOs who have deep expertise and knowledge and are really good at working with the grass tops need more support from the grassroots so that the politicians feel it in their home districts. So in an example like that, what you'd want is the big organizations that are working in that area, and I know I'll forget them, but well, Center for Science and the Public Interest is probably involved in this, as I'm understanding. Obviously, Food and Water Watch, I think NRDC and EWG, obviously. So to the extent that we can connect their campaigns with regional groups in districts, that's how you get to power. That's how you get to impact. That's how you make, going back to what we said at the beginning, the politicians feel the consequences of making the wrong decisions. So I'm just going to give you an example. If the California Food Policy Council joined forces with the effort that was just mentioned and was able to get the communities, the 30 communities it represents, to send out to all their connections in their communities a message that their constituents in those places would utilize to either contact a policymaker or contact a policymaker by a call or a letter. That's how you make it work, right? And so far what's happened, I think we know that we haven't had enough of that in most cases to get the changes that we want. I mean, the rider that went through Congress just now for what they're calling the Monsanto rider, why did that happen? Because whoever was behind that didn't feel there was going to be any pain for doing that. So, and they're going to keep feeling that unless we can actually connect the grassroots and that legislator or those legislators who were involved in that in their home district realize that they're going to pay for it. They're going to pay. They're not going to have votes from a significant number of people and maybe enough to make the difference. And in fact, they have to make the difference. We have to throw people out of office in order to make the pain clear. So how do you do it? You make contact. The question is, so this is what is required of all of us. We have to build that relationship, and we have to get beyond just talking, and that requires a level of trust for people to actually link their resources and staff and time. You have to build relationship.
Great. And Sarah Trist added in there that Pew and Healthcare Without Harm are also really moving the issue forward. So those are two other organizations working on antibiotic resistance.
That's great. In fact, there's a whole consortium I know that's working on it. So that's right. And yeah, I mean, you probably have links, Catherine, and we can provide links to people who want to email us to some of the nodes of activity around that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Charmaine has a question on the topic of engaging communities of color. She says she's doing organizing in Delaware around educating around GMOs, and she's been very deliberate in reaching out to organizations and churches with communities of color, and she finds it frustrating when she asks fellow organizers to reach out to these communities, and they put up some resistance. So do you have ideas or tactics for framing that discussion?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the core of the work that we're doing with People's Grocery. I think that, I have very little information about the situation, so I could be stepping in trouble here, but I'll share from our experience. First of all, communities of color, under-resourced communities have been utilized, in a sense used a lot through history in many different ways. So it's very difficult to go in on a specific issue item in a small time frame and expect deep allyship from the organization to contact it, because there's no context for it. What I mean by that is it's taken us really a year and a half of dialogue and doing small things together to develop a level of trust where now People's Grocery and Rock can write grant proposals together. We can go in and present to funders together. We can show up and talk positively and deeply about each other's work to our allies because we have experience and relationship. And I'm in a position now to go and ask People's Grocery to do things, and they're in a position to do the same thing with me. And because I have a level of trust with them, I'm willing to invest resources. I don't feel the risk that folks can feel if there's no relationship. So you may remember in that earlier slide I put it said reconciliation. One of the things I've realized in this work with People's Grocery and other groups in West Oakland is that there are historical feelings about being left out, underfunded, not understood, not listened to, or not. In our case, there were people who thought we didn't care about their interests, that we were just all talk. And so there's a period of reconciliation where you have to actually sit down and, again, build a relationship. You can't come in at the last minute or around a campaign that's already started and ask people to join. They have to be part of the conceiving of how it's going to happen, and they have to be part of doing it. Sharing the power of decision-making is the key.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question. Lil Duncan, have we intersected with hospitals and health centers to emphasize the connection between health and nutrition? So I think that's just kind of a general comment on sort of how do you involve hospitals and health centers? Do you have experience with that, and how can you make those links to involve them in the food movement?
Yes, great question, and the answer is yes. In fact, a couple of years ago, one of the early experiments and activities for us, and it's kind of spun off on its own now, was we reached out to a health clinic, and there are other people doing this in California. I know Ecology Center's doing it. I know a group in Santa Clara is doing it. Others are doing it. But we reached out to the Sutter. Well, there's a group of community health clinics in Sonoma County, where they're working with mothers, mostly Latina mothers, whose children are suffering from obesity or diet-related disease or on the verge of that. And we worked with the doctors to begin writing veggie prescriptions and providing funds for these mothers to go to farmers markets. Now, that project was really great, not only because of what was happening in terms of service delivery to those mothers and those farmers market and those farmers who were benefiting from the purchasing of fresh fruits, nuts, and vegetables, but the other great thing is that some of the docs became real spokespeople for us. One of the docs is also a chef. She trains as a chef, and she's a doctor. So she's an advocate for these issues, food system issues. Another member of the group is out actually talking nationally, and we've gotten her involved in different things about the kind of work and food system work, and she's thinking about food systems. In fact, she married a winemaker, and they're going biodynamically now. I mean, there's all kinds of things. Doctors are powerful levers. Kaiser's done a great job in California around this, working with their docs, really led by their docs to put farmers markets at their different sites. So I think doctors are really powerful, and it's an undertapped resource for the food movement. I think we're done.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michael. Your presentation was very powerful. I know that a lot of people got what they needed to get out of it and more. So we are looking forward to sharing this information with all of you through the recording, and hopefully Mike will be able to share his slides as well. Michael, do you have any closing thoughts?
Well, I'm happy that a lot of people participated, and I hope it was helpful. And I look forward to follow up and to seeing us develop deeper relationships and get to more trust and actually link up our activities at a deeper level. I think we're on the verge of it beginning to happen. So I'm very hopeful about the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And we will send links to those antibiotic resistance groups that people were asking about on request. So those of you who are interested in that, I have your emails, and I can get in touch with you to let you know about those consortia that we were talking about. So thank you again, Michael Dimock from Roots of Change, and thanks to everyone who was able to join today. All right, we'll end the webinar here, and take care, everyone.